When the stooped elderly woman in a modest dress arrived at the wedding, the bride's family barely acknowledged her presence. By the end of the night, they would be begging for her forgiveness, unaware they had disrespected a decorated military legend. The afternoon sun bathed the grand estate in a golden glow, its sprawling gardens meticulously arranged for the wedding of the year. White roses lined the cobblestone pathways, and crystal chandeliers dangled from towering oak trees, creating an air of effortless luxury. The guests, dressed in designer gowns and custom-tailored suits, sipped champagne, exchanging stories of extravagant vacations and million-dollar business deals. At the heart of the event stood Olivia Montgomery, the stunning bride, and Michael Carter, her soon-to-be husband. Their love story had been the talk of high society. Olivia, the daughter of an influential business family, and Michael, a highly successful entrepreneur with an inspiring work ethic. But today, amidst the beauty and celebration, something far less romantic was unfolding. Evelyn Carter arrived with quiet dignity, stepping out of the sleek black car with the help of Michael. At 75, her stooped shoulders and thin frame betrayed years of hard service. Her sparse silver hair was neatly combed, framing a weathered face that, despite the years, still held a resolute gaze. Dressed in a simple pale blue dress from another era, she carried herself with quiet determination, her worn hands clutching a small vintage purse. She had been waiting for this moment, seeing her grandson marry the love of his life. Yet as she walked through the sea of well-dressed guests, leaning slightly on her cane, something became painfully clear. The Montgomery family barely acknowledged her existence. Victoria Montgomery, the bride's mother, stood near the grand entrance, wine glass in hand, watching Evelyn with a barely concealed sneer. She turned to one of her relatives and whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I suppose some people don't understand the difference between a wedding and a church bingo night." A few polite laughs followed. Evelyn heard it, but she didn't flinch. She had encountered far worse during her military years. Olivia's father, Richard Montgomery, merely nodded in Evelyn's direction without offering a handshake or a word of welcome. To him, she was just another guest, an afterthought. The rest of the Montgomery clan followed suit, exchanging judgmental glances, subtly shifting their conversations away whenever Evelyn drew near. Michael noticed his jaw tightening, but Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's all right, dear," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "Some lessons take time." Her eyes, though surrounded by wrinkles, held the same resilience they had on battlefields far from home. He squeezed her hand, amazed at her grace under fire, a trait she'd never lost. As the celebration carried on, the microaggressions only became more evident. When Evelyn took a seat at one of the tables, guests subtly adjusted their chairs away. When she tried to engage in polite conversation, responses were clipped, dismissive. At one point, when she reached for an hors d'oeuvre from a passing tray, Victoria barely concealed her grimace. Michael's heart ached for his grandmother, but he also knew her well enough to recognize the quiet confidence she carried. She was unshaken. She had seen these kind of people before. The reception was in full swing, a dazzling display of wealth and privilege. Guests clinked their champagne glasses, their laughter ringing through the sprawling garden. Waiters in crisp white uniforms wove through the crowd, balancing trays of fine wine and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. The Montgomery family moved effortlessly through the sea of high society guests, basking in the glow of their own importance. But amid the luxury and celebration, an undercurrent of arrogance tainted the air. Victoria Montgomery, perched at a nearby table, swirled the deep red wine in her glass before leaning toward a group of relatives. Her lips curled into a practiced smile, her voice smooth but edged with something sharper. Michael turned out well considering his unconventional upbringing, she mused, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. A grandmother in the military. Can you imagine? Poor boy probably raised himself while she was off playing soldier. Evelyn lifted her gaze from her water glass, but said nothing. Her weathered hands remained steady. She had lived through too many wars, both abroad and at home, to be rattled by careless words. Michael, standing a few feet away, stiffened. He turned to Olivia, expecting her to react, to say something, but she hesitated, biting her lip. It was their wedding day, and she didn't want to cause a scene. At another table, Olivia's father, Richard Montgomery, sat comfortably surrounded by his closest associates, a man of power and influence who had spent his life making decisions that shaped industries. He spoke in a smooth, authoritative voice, and when he made a joke, people laughed whether it was funny or not. Now he was entertaining the table with offhand remarks about certain traditions being outdated. His words, though wrapped in a veil of sophistication, carried an unmistakable weight. The subtext was clear. There were old customs, and then there were better customs, the ones people of their status upheld. The Montgomery way. Michael clenched his fists. His family had traditions too, traditions of resilience, strength, and unity. His grandmother, sitting just a few feet away, was living proof of that. But Richard, he didn't even acknowledge her presence. Evelyn, however, remained unfazed. She had faced far worse in her lifetime. Disrespect from the small-minded was nothing new. Instead of reacting with anger, she responded with grace, offering quiet, thoughtful remarks throughout the evening. When a guest commented on the challenges of managing wealth, Evelyn smiled gently. True wealth isn't measured in numbers, but in the way you treat people. When someone scoffed at the idea of humble beginnings, she merely said, "You'd be surprised how many great things have come from places people choose to overlook." The Montgomerys barely noticed her words, but one man did. Across the reception, a well-dressed older gentleman sat alone, observing. He had sharp eyes, the kind that missed nothing, and a presence that commanded quiet respect. His tailored uniform, though simple, hinted at significant military rank, and the way he carried himself suggested he was no ordinary guest. He watched the way Victoria turned her nose up at Evelyn. He listened to the dismissive tone in Richard's voice. He saw the way guests subtly distanced themselves from the elderly woman at the table's edge, and he was not impressed. The reception carried on, the Montgomerys basking in their carefully curated social circle, oblivious of the shift that was about to take place. The gentle hum of classical music underscored the polite chatter, glasses clinking as guests toasted to the newlyweds. Then the event coordinator stepped onto the small stage at the center of the grand reception area, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice ringing through the open-air venue. "It is an honor to introduce a very special guest this evening, an individual whose contributions to national security and military strategy have left an indelible mark on this country. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest of honor." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Olivia's family straightened in their seats. The Montgomerys prided themselves on their elite social circle, and a guest of this caliber could only enhance their prestige. The well-dressed older gentleman who had been observing the night's events from afar finally stood. All eyes turned to him. The air buzzed with anticipation as murmurs spread among the guests. Victoria leaned toward her husband, whispering behind her hand, "That's General William Harrison, Pentagon's top advisor on international security. Richard, you should make sure to speak with him before he leaves." Richard nodded, already adjusting his tie, preparing to make an impression. In their world, connections were currency, and this was a valuable one indeed. The distinguished general stood tall in his formal uniform, adorned with rows of medals and ribbons that spoke of decades of service. His presence commanded attention without effort, the hallmark of true leadership. The Montgomery family waited eagerly, each mentally preparing their approach. A man of his stature would certainly head straight for the most influential people in the room, meaning them, of course. But what happened next sent a shock wave through the Montgomery family. Instead of heading to the podium, the distinguished man turned on his heel directly toward Evelyn Carter. A hush fell over the crowd as he approached the elderly woman with a warm, genuine smile. And then he bowed his head slightly. "General Carter," he said with deep reverence. "It's been too long, ma'am." Gasps rippled through the audience. General Carter? The tone in his voice, the gesture of respect. This was no casual acquaintance. This was admiration. Evelyn, still seated, met his gaze with a knowing smile. "Ah, William," she said smoothly, "you haven't changed a bit." Her posture, despite her stooped shoulders, seemed to straighten slightly, some echo of military bearings shining through. The Montgomerys froze. General William Harrison, The name finally registered in their minds. Not just any military man, but one of the most respected voices in national defense, whose counsel was sought by presidents and world leaders alike. And here he was, showing deference to the elderly woman they had dismissed without a second thought. Victoria's wine glass nearly slipped from her grasp. Richard's confident smirk had all but vanished. Olivia, her mouth slightly agape, looked between Evelyn and General Harrison, trying to process what was unfolding before her. Harrison gestured for the crowd's attention. "Many of you know me as a military strategist and advisor," he began, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "But I would be nowhere if it weren't for one person. The woman sitting right here, General Evelyn Carter." Stunned silence followed. He turned to Evelyn and offered a warm nod. General Carter is one of the greatest military minds of our time. Decades ago, she broke barriers as one of the first women to achieve her rank, leading intelligence operations that saved countless American lives. She developed strategies we still teach at West Point today, mentored generations of officers, myself included, and after retirement, continue to advise at the highest levels of national security. A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged guilty glances, suddenly recalling their dismissive behavior toward the elderly woman. Others simply gawked, their entire perception of the night shifting in real time. "She didn't just serve her country," Harrison continued, his voice carrying to the stunned audience. "She redefined what service means. The medal she declined to wear tonight tell only part of her story." The weight of his words settled over the Montgomery family, like a crushing realization. The very woman they had treated as less than was a titan in her own right, far more influential than any of them could ever hope to be. Richard Montgomery swallowed hard. His entire career had been about wealth, power, and knowing the right people. Yet the person he had ignored, no, the person he had disrespected, was someone far beyond his reach. Victoria, still reeling, tried to recover. She forced a brittle smile, leaning toward Evelyn. "Oh, we had no idea," she started, her voice laced with nervous laughter. Evelyn turned to her with a calm, unwavering gaze. "I know," she said simply. And in that moment, Victoria understood the weight of her own arrogance. Michael, who had spent the night biting his tongue, now stood a little taller, his pride for his grandmother shining in his eyes. As for Olivia, she had never felt so utterly ashamed. The night had started with the Montgomerys seeing Evelyn as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. But by the end of the evening, they realized it was they who were not worthy of being in hers. The grand estate, once filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, now buzzed with hushed whispers. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the crowd, and Olivia's family stood frozen in the weight of their own arrogance. Victoria's face had lost its usual composed elegance. Her carefully applied makeup did nothing to hide the sheer humiliation washing over her. She clutched her wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she processed the truth. Richard Montgomery, a man who prided himself on always being the most powerful person in the room, looked as if he had been punched in the gut. His entire world revolved around knowing the right people, being in the right circles. But the one person he had dismissed without a second thought was the very person whose respect truly mattered. The realization stung deeper than any public embarrassment. Guests, now aware of the insult that had transpired, stole discreet glances at Evelyn. Some looked ashamed, others fascinated. A few whispered apologies under their breath, though they weren't directed at her, more so at themselves for their silent complicity. Michael, who had spent the evening biting his tongue out of respect for his grandmother, finally stepped forward. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the heavy silence. "It's funny, isn't it?" he said, glancing at Olivia's parents. "You were so concerned with status, so worried about appearances, and yet you just disrespected the most important person in this room." Victoria and Richard flinched. Michael exhaled, shaking his head. "All night, you treated my grandmother like she didn't belong, like she wasn't good enough. And yet she has done more, built more, given more than most people in this room combined." Olivia, standing beside him, swallowed hard. She could feel the heat rising in her face. not just from secondhand embarrassment, but from the painful realization that her family had revealed their true nature in the worst way possible. Victoria tried to salvage the situation, pasting on a brittle smile. "Evelyn, dear," she began, her tone suddenly saccharine. "I had no idea. You really should have said something earlier. We would have." Evelyn lifted a single weathered hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "There was nothing to say," she replied smoothly, her voice calm but unwavering. "A person's worth isn't determined by what they tell you. It's revealed in how you treat them." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. She had no response to that. Richard, ever the businessman, extended a hand toward Evelyn, his smile forced. "Well, General Carter, it's truly an honor. Perhaps we can discuss." Evelyn simply looked at his outstretched hand. Then, with effortless grace, she turned away, as if dismissing the entire conversation. It was a greater insult than any words could have delivered. The Montgomerys were used to power, to wealth, to commanding attention in any room they entered. But tonight, they learned a lesson they could never undo. Status meant nothing if it was built on arrogance and ignorance. Evelyn, ever composed, didn't gloat. She didn't demand apologies or revel in their humiliation. Instead, she simply smiled and returned to her seat, enjoyed her dessert as if nothing had happened. Because that was the difference between them. True class wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about power. It was about character. And tonight, the Montgomerys had none. The evening drew to a close, a powerful reminder that respect isn't earned through wealth or status, but through actions and character. Sometimes the person you look down on today might be the very one who commands true respect tomorrow. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated? Comment your story of respect earned the hard way.